Please join me in welcoming James Jacobs.
Thanks, Bernie. I'm going to stick pretty closely to written text today so I can move through quickly. And I'm also, I had a little sharing thing planned for the end of this half-hour segment, but since we're running a little late, I'm going to do that a little bit differently. I am going to ask you to participate in this session. So if you have a note-taking device, a favorite note-taking device, if you have that handy and open or sharpened, and if you use Twitter, if you're getting ready to tweet a little bit later, we're going to do a little exercise even if we can't share everything real time. I am here to report on this paper that I wrote for CRL. It's one of your background readings, and I don't want to repeat the details of it, but what I do want to do is review some of the issues and findings of the paper, provide a little historical context that's not in the paper, and then suggest a framework for addressing some of the issues that the paper raises. At this URL, 3stages.org/CRL, I put links to the paper, to my presentation notes, as well as other links that I'll be mentioning as I go along, so you don't have to write down every URL or citation. Let's start with the gaps in what we know. A great deal of the problem of preserving born digital government information can be attributed to the gaps in what we know. For example, there's no directory or listing or catalog of all government information. In fact, we do not even have a list of authentic, complete list of all the government websites from which we might try to compile a list of all public government information. In addition, libraries and other memory organizations do not have a unified approach to identifying and sharing information about what we have saved. So it's hard to tell if we already have something, if someone else has it, if we've got something that we know exists and needs to be saved, if there are gaps. But there are some things that we know. First, we know that FDLP libraries have successfully preserved millions of volumes of non-digital government information over 100 or 200 years, depending on how you count. And we know how that happened and why it happened. We can see from this greatly simplified and horribly incomplete life cycle model on the left that has creation, production, and preservation, that there was an agency that accepted primary responsibility for each of those stages of the preservation life cycle in the past. The agencies would create information, GPO would produce and distribute it, and libraries would preserve and provide services for it. And for a long time, this worked pretty well. We called information that was outside of the system fugitive because it had escaped and was subject to loss and was hard to find. We also know that most born digital government information is not being preserved or organized or served by libraries today. And we know why. Libraries have been relying on government agencies to preserve their own information. And we have enough experience in seeing us do that to draw some conclusions from it. First, we know that putting complete responsibility for the preservation of any body of information on the shoulders of any single institution is risky. In such a case, the preservation is at the mercy of the budget priorities, the social priorities, the technologies of that particular organization. It's more risky still if the organization is primarily a creator, as most government agencies are, and does not have preservation as a primary mission. And very, very few government agencies have preservation as a mission at all. And finally, it's still riskier if the organization itself is governed by politicians who have a political stake in the control of that information. I've heard a lot of librarians over the years say that the situation that we're in now, where libraries don't have government information, was inevitable with a shift to digital publishing, but I don't agree with that. Let me give you two non-technical reasons why government information is not being preserved in libraries today. In 1983, there was a Supreme Court decision called INS versus Chadha And although it didn't deal directly with GPO or FDLP, it had an effect on those agencies because on those systems, because what it did is it allowed government agencies to not publish through GPO. Didn't tell them they couldn't or shouldn't, it just allowed them not to. So agencies chose to not use GPO, and that life cycle model broke because there was no one anymore responsible for producing preservable objects, if you will, and distributing them to preservation institutions. Although libraries attempted to identify fugitives, they did not put enough resources in them to adequately capture everything. So we got a lot more fugitives and lost a lot of information. 10 years later, in 1983, Public Law 10340 was passed. I'm trying to skip a little bit here. This law was passed. It directed GPO to do two things: provide electronic storage and online access for government information. Although Congress has continued in its appropriations bills to direct Congress to provide both deposit and online access, GPO has chosen over the years to take on the preservation aspect itself solely. In 1995, shortly after this law went into effect, GPO just asserted that it would take sole responsibility for permanent access, even though Congress neither suggested nor authorized that role for it. Libraries then accepted that, with the result that most foreign digital government information has not been going into FDLP libraries. The point of these two examples is that these problems of preserving information are not new, and they're not based in technology. They're based in decisions that people make. This brings us to the third thing we know. The scope of foreign digital government information now greatly outpaces what is being done to preserve it. And if you've had a look at the report, you'll recognize this histogram, which compares all tangible documents published in or distributed to FDLP libraries in 1 year. That's the left column, which you probably can't see. And in the middle column, the 2 to 3 million items that have accumulated in FDLP libraries over 100 to 200 years. And in the right column, the one that you can see, the 160 million URLs collected by the 2008 end-of-term crawl, which attempted to take a snapshot of government at the end of the 2008 term. If we had to draw one conclusion from all this, it would be that no one knows how much U.S. federal government information has been created, or where it is, or how much of it is being preserved. The fact that we do not know this is clearly the most obvious of a bunch of gnarly issues that we have to deal with before we start thinking about how to do something else. Let's look quickly at some of the other issues. These are explained in more detail in the report, but I want to mention them all at least quickly. Because digital documents can be changed easily, it's important that preservation activities identify different versions, both in order to preserve unique information and also to minimize preserving duplicate information unnecessarily. I'm going to move closer to the mic. Is that better? You've probably all seen the Chesapeake report that reported that 51% of the .gov links that it had tracked over 8 years had broken. That's a bad thing that digital preservation can help us solve. Temporal context is something that is much overlooked in the area of preservation. Users of preserved information need a way of using information in the context in which it was created. A link in a document should not only work when a user clicks on a preserved link, but it also should point to the information that the author linked to when that link was created, not some new version of it that the author never saw. I provided on the Three Stages site some links about this, a paper and an interview with Herbert van de Sample, which if you're not familiar with this issue, I encourage you to look at. The proliferation of e-government services has led some librarians to suggest that these services obviate the need for libraries to have collections of government information at all. I would suggest that the opposite is true. To see this, we only need to recognize that there's a difference between e-government, which is a service that uses government information, and the information itself, which is a resource. This means that e-government services often have the effect of hiding the resource behind the service. That makes it harder for us to identify, evaluate, acquire, and preserve the resource itself. The availability of e-government services should be seen as an impediment to digital preservation, not an excuse to ignore digital preservation. As I've mentioned, most government agencies do not have a legal mandate to preserve all their information for the long term. That means that relying on those agencies for preservation is risky. Even those that do have preservation as a mission do not have the resources to do so adequately, as we heard yesterday. Even GPO's legislated mission of providing access to government information does not specify that it must keep everything online forever for free. In fact, the law specifically allows GPO to charge for information. Although the current administration of GPO operates under the intention of preserving and making everything for free forever, there's no guarantee that a different administration at GPO would not make a different choice, as indeed different GPO administrations have in the past. The huge volume of digital information makes selection more important to preservation than ever before. When libraries rely on issuing agencies to preserve their agency information, they relinquish to those agencies the decision of what is worth preserving and what will be lost or thrown away. Libraries will often define the scope of what needs to be preserved different from the agencies and different from each other. And that's a good thing because it gives us more participants in deciding what needs to be preserved. Finally, collections without services are of little value to our communities of users. We've really heard this as a theme through yesterday and this morning. When we build dark archives with no access and little organization, we're not creating a value that our communities can see and use. Libraries thinking of preservation, therefore, should be thinking of access and services that provide immediate value to their users. What I want to do now is characterize two dimensions of preservation that we might take as lessons from the preservation activities that we've seen. First, we do know that there are three typical models of who does preserving these days. The government can do things alone, such as when the National Archives builds its own preservation repository. Government can work with non-government partners. And a good example of that is GPO's current working with the LOX US Docs Alliance to preserve government information. And we can see non-government agencies working without any government cooperation, such as the Internet Archive trying to scrape the web. We know, or should know, that relying on the government alone is risky for the reasons I've mentioned earlier. We also know that trying to locate, identify, and acquire digital content without the cooperation of the government is at best difficult and prone to errors and gaps and unnecessary duplication. And on the Three Stages site, I've presented some examples. If you're unfamiliar with web harvesting, I've given you some examples of why that's difficult and a link to a really nice podcast where a couple of web harvesters relate their experiences. I think it should be self-evident that the ideal preservation strategy would be for the government to cooperate with memory institutions. We also know a second lesson, which is that there are different available methods of selection of what needs to be preserved. Broadly speaking, there are three methods of selecting. Broad web harvesting, which is what the Internet Archive does. Let's just try and get everything. Focused selection, which could be either a focused harvest to a particular agency or a particular group of agencies, or it could be individual title by title selecting, like the Chesapeake Project does. And what I would call digital deposit, in which those who create and produce the information create preservable digital objects which they deposit with memory institutions. To ensure adequate preservation for all of our user communities, we'll probably need a mix of these strategies. Finally, I want to suggest a framework for addressing these issues. Preservation should not be seen as an isolated activity. Rather, it should be connected to access. Further, our preservation activities should be part of us building digital collections for use. As we design preservation strategies, we should include organization, discovery, and access, and service, and utility. We can do this by focusing on our different user communities first. We should complement a provenance approach where you look at an agency or a domain or a website for preservation with a user-centered approach. Rather than only looking at the web and asking, what should we preserve, we should look to our users and ask, what do they need? This gives the community of libraries an opportunity to expand how we collaborate and expand how we think about our user communities. Instead of limiting a library's community to those who are geographically local, we can begin to identify communities that have similar content interests and use needs in our building of collections to serve them. With the power of sharing collections on the web, we should collaboratively build collections that fit the needs of unique communities. For example, a group of libraries could build a shared collection for a specific user community with shared content needs. Disciplines like law and medicine and agriculture meet this criteria quite easily, but also subdisciplines do, specialized subdisciplines like community health or epidemiology and nutrition or food security. We could also build collaborative services that provide different kinds of functionality to different user communities. For example, a demographer or a sociologist or a historian might want raw access to census data to do data mining and statistical analysis, whereas an undergraduate's needs might well be met by aggregate tables of statistics and a simple lookup function. So we could provide two different services for the same content to different communities and do that collaboratively. The above thoughts lead me to conclude that every library should participate in digital preservation. The reasons for this go beyond preservation. This is about building the value of libraries by providing a combination of collections and services that are reliable and useful. This does not mean that every library has to build a data center. This is not about technology. Shared collections and services can be built with different kinds of participations by different libraries. Some libraries could function as data centers. Some libraries could create services and create metadata. Every library could select, and so on. We faced similar challenges to these in the past, and I would point you to the Documents Expediting Project that worked from 1946 to 2004 out of the Library of Congress to identify fugitive documents and get those documents to their users. And the Ambitious Farmington Plan, which worked between the 40s and 60s, and the Center for Research Libraries. In summary, I believe that we can preserve born digital government information because the technology exists. I believe that every library can participate because the entry cost is low. I believe that we can add value to the information by building collections of use for our communities. And I believe we can add value to our libraries by providing collections plus services for our communities. The result will be more than preserving government information. Users will directly and immediately benefit by the value that libraries provide to them with these collections and services. We might almost say that preservation should be about access rather than preservation, but that would be too far. I want to stop now.